think the lighting's pretty okay. As good as it ever gets. So, yeah, I purpose of this video today, I want to talk about some things that I got into when I went live on Friday the 13th, when I did the Solar Eclipse video. So I touched on some topics that I didn't get to talk about as completely as I'd like. So I just kind of want to just add on to that for my own sake. Just things I'm really interested in. And, obviously, if you follow this channel, I don't have some massive following. There are people who tell me they get something out of my videos. I do it for my own mental health, so I can just kind of do a brain dump and get it out there. So anyway, let's go into this. One thing that I mentioned on that Friday the 13th video was that every October 13th, it's the anniversary of the Templar arrest in France back in 1307. So that's why Friday the 13th is considered a bad luck day. If you're a member of a secret society, it's a bad luck day. But for the rest of us, it's like, whatever. So, and it's kind of a special year when Friday the 13th falls in October. So, it's kind of why I mentioned that. So anyway, I mentioned the Templars. Now, the Templars are a sticky thing. Let's get into the meat of this. The Templars are a very sticky thing. And few groups, I think, have captured the imagination of the New Age the way the Templars have. So in the New Age, in the spiritual community, you'll see things like, oh, the Templars were building a utopia, and it's like that kind of thing. And anything to do with Templars has just been hot for a long time, especially since probably in the last 30 years, like the Holy Blood, Holy Grail books and Da Vinci Code and all kinds of, and that stuff. So often in the New Age, in the spiritual community, the Templars will be viewed as good guys who were suppressed, by the evil Christian church and the kings in Europe that were, kings and queens and aristocrats. You can never leave the ladies out. Horrible men are always surrounded by horrible women. It's a package deal. So anyway, so the Templars are seen as, they kind of get victim status, and they're seen as like a good alternative, a good and holy and righteous alternative to the evil royals and aristocrats and Christian church. Well, the Templars were gangsters too. They were international pimps and financiers and money lenders and warmongers, just like the royals, the aristocrats, the churches, the other merchant bankers. When you really look at the Templars, they sort of gave birth to a lot of the institutions we have today. So the whole modern banking and credit system, that was them. The secret societies that we know of, Freemasonry has a lot of Templar roots. I think it has roots in the Druids too, who were, very unrelated. But we've got this banking system. We have all these Masonic organizations. So like educational institutions are Masonic, modern militaries, police departments, the fire departments, they all have these crosses with equilateral arms, equal length arms, and there's a lot of Masonic shit going on. Universities are extremely Masonic. So they gave birth to a lot of, the modern things that we have going on. And wars have always been fought over resources, but the way the Templars used a private army to protect their gold shipments, and things like that. They had a very significant role in creating the modern world. With these for-profit wars that are now very commonplace and that actually prop up everyone's investments. So yeah, the Templars were no holier than the church. They just had a different agenda. And, to make a long story short, the Templars were founded by people in France and modern day Belgium, very wealthy families who got wealthy through the wool trade. They owned a lot of land, a lot of sheep. They harvested the wool and they sold it. And it was extremely lucrative. They even came up with the concept of a trade show where merchants could gather and buy and sell with each other, and then members of the public could come in, and then the whole thing would be protected, from theft. They came up with that whole thing. So you had these families in France and Belgium. These families in France and Belgium had some ancestors that came from the Holy Land, well, what's called the Holy Land, Palestine, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, after the Judean War in the year 70, after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. So these people, and some people say it was even, the 24 elders of the temple fled to Europe. And, there's a lot of documentation and evidence that these people actually arrived in southern France. And then you get this whole, the Da Vinci Code narrative is built on this. So these people settled in France. They made their, in southern France, they made their way north, even up into Belgium, and really, out across Europe. So what they had more sophisticated ways of basically lending money and playing financial games, and they became very important to the royals and the aristocrats and the church. So these families who were descended from these elites that came from, Palestine, Israel, after the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70, they started putting members of their family on thrones in Europe. And I think after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70, they had a plan to basically take over the Roman Empire. And it was going to take generations and centuries, but they were set on doing it. So these families set up the Templar order in order to go back to the Jerusalem to retrieve things. So these people were very instrumental in getting the church to instigate the first crusade. So even though the crusades went on for about 200 years, these families who founded and funded the Templar order, they went over there and they did a bunch of archaeological digs under the Temple Mount. And I'd say within about 10, 20 years, they got everything they wanted. So the war was like a giant cover for them. But the war also allowed them to lend huge money to the kingdoms, the churches, and they created, a bunch of debt. So they were pretty clever and they were very insidious. They were very sneaky. So yeah, they were into everything. They had the largest navy in Europe, the largest army, and they actually just used to shake down ships, in the Mediterranean or in the Atlantic. So they were basically pirates. They used to, that skull and crossbone flag, they were the first ones to fly that. And if they thought a ship had something on there that they wanted, the Templar Navy would just go board the ship and they'd say, what do you got here? You got to give us something if you want us to leave. So they were mafiosi. They were a bunch of international gangsters. So, and the Templars too, they were the roots of modern world communism come from the Templars. And it even goes further back than that. Really, I think Christianity as we know it, it was founded by, there was a king, King Abgar of Edessa. This is who the Jesus character is based on. He was Jewish by religion, but he was an Edomite. So these people from east of the River Jordan who crossed into Lebanon, Israel, Syria, and became Jewish. So he was one of them. He saw the power in creating an export version of Judaism, which later became called Christianity. And he knew that religion was extremely lucrative. So in the early days, to become a Christian, you had to turn over all of your private property to the church. And then years later, almost 1,000 years later, the Templars did the same thing. To join the order, you had to give up all of your private property, your personal property. So religious cults, there's extreme wealth. There's a lot of money to be made in starting one and running one. So this is a lot like communism. You know, in a communist system, in a communist country, you're not allowed to own any personal property. So, you know, property is so-called held in common by all, but the people running the system have access to all that wealth. It really becomes their wealth. The people, the elites of society who run the system. You know, the leaders of the Soviet Union lived in luxury, while, you know, everyone else just ate boiled potatoes every day, you know, and froze their asses off. So, you know, the roots of, you know, international communism, it really goes back to those early Christian days. You know, I'm not telling people dump your religion if you're a Christian, but just know where things come from. So, and what these movements have in common, you know, socialism, communism, Templarism, Christianity, it's a centrally planned society. There's a book of rules, you follow the rules, you fulfill your role in the system, and you don't step outside of it. So, you know, the whole communism thing, it's very old. And, you know, it's interesting, like when religious people think they're right wing, it's like, no, not really. There really isn't like a real right wing movement in the whole world today. So they all go back to the same thing: Templars, Christianity, communism, socialism. So the Templars wanted to build this communist system, and they wanted to basically get all of the private property from not just the people, but the aristocrats, the royals, the church. They wanted to absorb it all in the name of holiness and divinity and spirituality and all this stuff. And one of the ways they were doing that to win the people's favor, they would teach people how to read. They would teach people practical skills. They would help elevate them above the poverty they were often living under in the kingdoms they lived in under, you know, the Christian church too. So they knew how to ingratiate themselves with people. They knew how to give things to people so that people would like them. So, you know, this stuff is so old, it's new. So this is, you know, who the Templars were. So jumping to another point, it's interesting that the leader of Hamas, can't remember his name again, how he called on Muslims worldwide to have an international day of jihad and martyrdom on Friday the 13th. Well, one of the interesting things with the Templars here is that the Templars were colluding with Islamic elements during the Crusades and even afterwards. And pretty much everyone listening to this channel has heard of MK Ultra and mind control and behavior modification. And these are real programs. The Central Intelligence admitted to the Senate that they actually did this stuff, but, you know, they swore in their scouts honor, you know, that they quit. Those techniques, there's very strong evidence to suggest that those techniques of behavior modification and mind control were taught to the Templars by the Order of the Assassins. So there was a Sufi Islamic splinter group that were basically assassins for hire. And this is one of the charges brought against the Templars, which I think was a real charge, you know, when they were arrested, when the head of the order was arrested in Paris. This was one of the charges brought against them. So there's been a collusion, I think, between these so-called Templar groups and Islam since the 1100s. So we're going on 1,000 years here. And it's interesting too, the Nazis, people like, the likes of Joseph Mengele, Dr. Mengele, and Germany, doctors of his ilk, they were far ahead of the rest of the West when it came to mind control and behavior modification using those technologies. And knowing that about the Nazis, an interesting thing about the Nazis is the leadership had a deep interest in Islam, especially Sufi Islam. And they even raised SS divisions from Turkey, from, the Turks, from the Bosnians, from Islamic populations, and they would wear the fez, that round Islamic hat, it's flat on top, it has a little tassel that comes down. Those units would wear that fez with their SS uniforms, and it would have a death's head, it would have a skull and crossbones, again, a Templar symbol. So you had massive Nazi interest in Islam, especially Sufi Islam, who were the originators of mind control. And then the Nazis had a deep interest in Templarism. And one of the interesting things that's not well known about the Nazis was that for their post-war agenda, had they won the war, they wanted to convert the SS and then eventually the population of the Third Reich to Islam, because they considered it the best religion for soldiers. Because in Islam, there's all this propaganda about, if you die in a holy war, a holy jihad, helping to conquer another country, to bring it under the rule of Islam, you're going to go to heaven with your 70 virgins and all that shit. So, you're going to go to paradise for being a martyr. So this stuff has been going around for a long time. So there's all these weird overlaps between the Templars and Islam. So it's interesting that the head of Hamas, this terror organization, called on Friday the 13th, which is the Templar anniversary, to be the International Day of Martyrdom in Jihad. So, just one of the points of this video is these Templars were and are, they're just an international mafia and an investment bank, just like any other. And they are actually some of the early proponents of world communism. One of the things that world communism has always set out to do, just like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, just like Templarism, is to break down countries, tribes, and cultures. And so it's all about superimposing, forcing this religious cult onto all tribes and races of people, and getting them to forget their native spiritualities, their native customs, their native cultures. So it's a one-size-fits-all, a very socialist kind of an idea, where you're gonna have one religion for the whole world, or three religions for the whole world. So, the Templars, they're antecedents to the communists. They're ancestors of the communists. So very similar values with that, and they had their own propaganda and their own version, their own narrative of how the world is. So, I kind of caution people about, getting too starstruck by the Templars, because it's like, they're just a bunch of gangsters. There's nothing holy or righteous or anything like that about them. So, it's funny, the Templars are kind of becoming like a multiracial phenomenon, because they did have a presence in Ethiopia for some time. They did build churches and temples and things there. But, and it's interesting, like out in LA in the last few years, you had Black Americans, African Americans, they basically created their own police uniforms, and they called themselves like the Masonic police, Masonic Templar police or some shit. And they were like driving around, like pulling people over and like writing people tickets. and they had no like government authority. I don't think the government's the ultimate authority, but these people just decided to do this, and they were part of some, black Templar group, and they were like, "Oh, our ancestors were Knights Templar," and it's like, well, you know, again, Templars, the people who started the Templars are a bunch of gingers, and it's like super fair, freckly gingers. It's like Jesus and Mary Magdalene are depicted as strawberry blonde, ginger blonde, because this group of people that got the Christian church going, they said, hey, let's take Judaism, simplify it, make an export version, give it to the Gentiles, and we can start accumulating political power and wealth. That King Abgar and his tribe, they were these gingers from out in like Iran. They were like a type of, they were Persians. And, the modern day descendants of this so-called holy bloodline, it's the House of Orange. So the royal family of the Netherlands, they're a bunch of gingers. And that name Orange even goes back into, what we call biblical times, like 2,000 years ago. That was the name of the family. So it's funny, but you've got other ethnic groups, races trying to piggyback on this whole thing. And it's like, well, so you had this like these Black Americans calling themselves this Masonic police force. Well, most Black Americans have West African heritage. There weren't really many Ethiopians that were brought to America as slaves. The Ethiopians were actually slave traders. The Ethiopians and the Arabs, they ran the whole African slave trade. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole too deep, but different African tribes would fight, and they would capture people from other tribes or their own tribes, and they would sell them to the Arabs and the Ethiopians. So the Ethiopians were huge slave traders, which, the Templars, I think, really had no problem with either. So, yeah, it's just this whole Templar thing gets very mystified, and people get starstruck, and it's like, and they want to cling to, things that have to do with the Templars, but it's like, they're a bunch of assholes, And, another thing too, the Templars, I think they were screwing around with beings that Muslims call Jinn. So Jinn they're lower dimensional beings, but they like to convince humans that they're gods. They have a lifespan. They have places they like to live. They need to eat. They eat energy. I think they eat human emotional energy. So I think the Templars were messing around with these things. And I think in the Middle East, people were messing around with these jinns for ages. And I think that's what Arks of the Covenant are really about. So that's one of those things too, like that goes hand in hand with this Templarism, is like the interest in the Ark of the Covenant. Well, there wasn't one Ark of the Covenant, because what is a covenant? It's a contract. There are Egyptian hieroglyphics that go back thousands of years, and they were basically building these arks, these things that look like modern church depictions of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, from what I've read and researched, I think Arks of the Covenant, because many hundreds were made over the years, and they even made things that looked like this out in Tibet, out in Japan, in India and Afghanistan, all across Eurasia, they made these Arks of the Contract, Arks of the Covenant. What I think Arks of the Covenant amount to are magic lamps for genies. So genies, Jinn is where we get this word genie. So genies, jinns, again, it's this lower dimensional being that can perceive things that humans can't. And it likes to convince humans that, it's an all-powerful God. And it likes to seek out humans that don't have good boundaries, good healthy boundaries, and it sees what the humans will do for it. Basically, it's like, oh, go conquer these people, get me some blood, give me a sacrifice, you know what I mean? Or just like whatever it is, go make these people wear masks. Make these people get an injection. It's just, it sees what it can get away with and what it can get humans to do to feed it emotional energy. So I think the Templars were doing this, and I think they were building different structures in order to house these Arks of the Covenant that had these Jinn inside them. I don't think this is true about all the Templar cathedrals. Like, you go to Notre Dame or Chartres, places like that. Notre Dame in Strasbourg. Well, actually, that's a newer. No, it's Templar Cathedral. Anyway, you go to these Templar cathedrals, and the energy is very pristine and very clean. But you go to a place like Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. The Templars are very entrenched in Scotland. And I went to Rosslyn once, and it gave me the creeps. Then, I've been listening to a guy's videos named Thomas Sheridan. And he was talking about how just creepy and how drained he felt at Rosslyn. And I was like, oh, holy shit. So I guess that's why. And a lot of people have been saying this. It's like, yeah, if you go near the crypt at Rosslyn, it just feels terrible. And the whole facility feels weird. So I think, in the Sinclair family that built Rosslyn Chapel back in the 1400s, they were Templars. They were very involved in the Templar Navy. So I think they built Rosslyn Chapel to house one of these Arks of the Covenant that has one of these jinns living inside it. Again, it's basically a glorified magic lamp, these arks. So, yeah, again, it's like, be careful how starstruck you get about the Templars. They were just a group of assholes who were competing with the assholes who ran the church and who ran the kingdoms in Europe, and everywhere else in the world. They're no better, and really, the Templars, I think, they're like the descendants of the Zealots, the Jewish Zealots from back during, biblical times, early Christian times. Judaism had three main sects. It had Pharisees, Sadducees, and then the Essenes. Well, then you had the fourth, were the Zealots, and the Zealots, I think, were the founders of modern Christianity. But then as time went on, I think sort of a fifth sect developed that wasn't really committed to, the spread of rabbinical Judaism, aka communism. And they basically just wanted to get rich and do their own thing. That became the Vatican. So the Templars, I think they're like this fourth sect of zealots, like the Iscariots, like Judas Iscariot. So yeah, I think the Templars, they're money lenders, they're international global financiers, war profiteers, Jinn worshippers. They're nothing better than any of the governments or any of the other churches. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to bring all that into the mix. And they're sort of some of the early fathers and mothers of world communism. So, because it's all about getting people, all of these systems, it's about getting people to give up their private property, give it to this cause that's going to save them and is going to supposedly bring them spiritual immortality and redemption and all this shit, which only you can give yourself. It's by working with your higher dimensional self. That's a big thing. The way I do astrology readings and rune readings for people, I teach people how to work with these tools, how to work with the planet that connects you to your higher self. And when you're working with the runes, You're working with your higher self and bringing these energies in. So yeah, only you can give yourself spiritual immortality and redemption and all that kind of thing. And really, you don't have to be redeemed anyway. That's a bunch of emotional blackmail. Um, so I think that's pretty much what I wanted to say about those topics. But if you want to see who the Templars are in the world today, just look at the banks. The banks, the militaries, the governments, the secret society lodges. It's like they're nothing better than any of their alternatives. It's just a bunch of assholes fighting over the world, fighting over your mind, your body, your property, your health, and your identity. They want to take these things from you and subjugate you in order to harvest your emotional energy. So don't let it happen. Don't get starstruck by these people. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Have a nice one.